And my chairman, Quentin Kopp, will be appearing at some point as well, because Quentin has been here more recently even than me, because possibly you know that the Orwell Society acquired the library of the Orwell expert Professor Peter Davison when the professor died, and we have placed that library here in the Wigan Museum of Life. It's the best resource of Orwell's study outside London, and possibly better or equal to the one at University College London, which is the only one which can be compared to it. But anyway, we're going to talk about Gerrard Winstanley and George Orwell. I'm going to begin by just giving you a quotation from a significant work of political analysis whose authorship is uncertain and whose date of publication is dubious. It begins with this observation. Throughout recorded time, and probably since the end of the Neolithic Age, there have been three kinds of people in the world: the high, the middle, and the low. They have been subdivided in many ways. They have borne countless different names, and their relative numbers as well as their attitude towards one another has varied from age to age. But the essential structure of society has never altered. Even after enormous upheavals and seemingly irrevocable changes, the same pattern has always reasserted itself, just as a gyroscope will always return to equilibrium, however far it is pushed one way or the other. The aim of these three groups are entirely irreconcilable. We may come back to that quotation. But why should we talk about Gerrard Winstanley and George Orwell? Well, Orwell reviewed Winstanley. He wrote about Winstanley elsewhere. Orwell shared experiences with Winstanley of political activity during wartime, and at least, like Winstanley, on one occasion being on the losing side. In Orwell's case, that was with the Republican forces when he fought in Spain. As we're going to explore further, Winstanley was a man who was getting back to the land. Orwell knew the importance of land and cultivation and made references to it. Of course, he wouldn't have been unique in all of these sorts of things, even in his own time. Only this year we've discovered where George Orwell was, on Census Day 1921, Sunday the 19th of June. He was still then Eric Blair. And on Sunday the 19th of June 1921, he was on Cousin Farm in Ashford in Kent at the age of 17. He was still Eric Blair, as I say. He wasn't with his family. There are other people who weren't members of the farmer's family on that farm, but what he was doing, we don't know. But clearly, he was possibly going for some sort of experience of the land. It was something that other middle-class families like his were doing. John Wyndham, the man who went on to write The Day of the Triffids, had experience as a sheep farmer. And the better example between the wars was a chap called Adrian Bell. You know his surname because his son is famous. Is Martin Bell, the journalist in the white suit. Adrian Bell was a journalist. He drew the first crossword for the Times, but he wrote a trilogy of books about his experience as a young man of trying to get onto the land, books called Cherry Tree, Corduroy, Silverleaf. I'm going to concentrate on Orwell and the land and the concept of cultivation. We'll discover that he saw these concepts in very much everything he wrote, and no matter what he was writing about, he could see the relevance of it. A couple of years ago in 2021, Rebecca Solnit published a book, Orwell's Roses, because she'd noticed very much the same sort of thing, although she didn't draw the same radical conclusions that I think I'm going to draw. She had noticed that at the cottage and smallholding on which Eric Blair, George Orwell and his wife lived from 1936 to 1940 at Wallington in Hertfordshire, that the rose bush he talked about planting was possibly the one that was still growing there today. And Orwell had written about this in his journalism, and she said he had an appreciation for the natural life. But I think what we can actually do is go into this in even further detail. Another book which references Orwell in less detail, only in a couple of occasions, but is a much larger volume, and perhaps some of you who are interested in this area know it, came out about 10 years ago. Margaret Willis's book, The Gardens of the British Working Class. I can remember going back, thinking about life in the here in the Northwest, reading Robert Roberts's book, the classic Slum, about growing up in Salford during the First World War. And he has references there to the miserable conditions of attempting to grow anything in the backyards, of being sold soil by the corporation gardeners in an attempt to get things to grow, and finding that they never did. So all of these sorts of things have always been in the air. But particularly, let's tie them to Gerrard Winstanley and the concept of the diggers. Gerrard Winstanley, born of a family which must have been relatively well off to give him an education which we can recognise when we read the standard of what he wrote. Born in Wigan, but took his career up and moved to London, becoming the mercer, a cloth dealer, and then finding, as in many conditions, as we've heard after the Napoleonic Wars, again, economic collapse because of the development of the English Civil War, and Winstanley was driven out, moved to Kopp, where he met the man Gerrard, who was possibly a ranter or a leveller, and took the theories that the levellers had even further, so that the group that he became associated with regarded the levellers as not being radical enough, of being the men of the landowning classes, so that they called themselves the true levellers. The diggers are the true levellers. The levellers are those possibly already being regarded as betraying these things. Now, in September 1944, George Orwell reviewed this book, selections from the works of Gerrard Winstanley. It wasn't this individual volume, but this is a first edition. And in fact, when my copy arrived from a second-hand dealer, I was thrilled to discover that this copy had actually been owned by one of Orwell's school friends, a man called Roger Miners. And Orwell immediately puts it into a political context. He begins his review with a reference. Every successful revolution has its June purge, he says. He doesn't say which June, but he supposes that his readers are politically aware enough to know that there were so many of them. The Girondins in France during the revolution in June 1793 had been purged. The Nazis in June 1934 had the Rome purge. The Stalinist opposition, the old Bolsheviks, had been put up against the wall and shot in June 1937. But Orwell was looking back to June purges of 1649, 1650, of the diggers. Orwell expands on the suppression, but explains the diggers were swiftly crushed. The parvenu gentry who had won the Civil War were willing enough to divide the lands of the Royalists among themselves, but they had no intention of setting up an egalitarian society. I think Orwell is slightly wrong there about the division of the lands, because essentially a lot of people on both sides kept their lands. Most of Cromwell's sons were allowed to keep their estates, for instance. Orwell points out that the troops sent against the diggers, who started to build their communal farm on the land at St George's Hill, just outside Cobham, just underneath what is now Cliff Richard's private house. And he points out that Orwell points out that the troops sent against the diggers tended to be sympathetic because there was a strong leveller movement, a radical leveller movement in the army. But Winstanley and his colleagues were driven off, even despite the resistance that they put up, and more particularly, despite the fact that Winstanley appealed to law. One of his principal complaints is not that there was no law, but that the law could be abused against him, and that juries could be rigged in the favour of the landowners, and that contracts could be breached. It's slightly extraordinary to find that when we're talking about a figure who is so radical, that what he's doing is expressing it in terms of law. Orwell's review had appeared in the mass circulation Sunday paper, The Observer. He continued his references to Gerrard Winstanley when he published his book with Reginald Reynolds called British Pamphleteers, and looked at the pamphlets that they were producing then. And then finally, something again which could be read at the time only here in the North West. He published his series called The Intellectual Revolt, his 1946 essay series in the Manchester Evening News. Each of 4 essays was a thematic study. It was the second one, which was called What is Socialism? An essay much less well known than his essay called What is Fascism? Because What is Socialism was not republished in the 1968 collected essays. Orwell considers Winstanley again, talks about this book, Gerrard Winstanley's Selections. He uses the phrase primitive communism crushed by Cromwell, and then says, the earthly paradise has never been realised, but as an idea, it never seems to perish in spite of the ease with which it can be debunked by practical politicians of all colours. He ends, it could be claimed that the utopians, at present a scattered minority, are the true upholsters of socialist tradition. Now, Orwell had actually put Winstanley into a particular political line of thought. Orwell had said Winstanley's thought links up with anarchism rather than socialism because he thinks in terms of a purely agricultural community living at a low level of comfort. Orwell went on to examine Winstanley's complaint against the Normans, whom Winstanley blamed for the historic loss of common rights. This is something that Orwell expands on in that book, British Pamphleteers. But Orwell went on to say, in his review, but alas, he, Winstanley, could see only too clearly that the victors of the Civil War were themselves developing Norman characteristics. And with hindsight, we can now read a suggestion of Winstanley in Orwell's own story of agricultural betrayal portrayed as Animal Farm. Now, did Orwell put this into any wider context? Well, I think certainly he did. And if we go back to the work which will bring many of us here, and has brought many of us here on multiple occasions, in chapter 2 of the Road to Wigan Pier, that's the chapter often called Down the Mine, the one describing Orwell's Down the Mine, he actually begins it by saying, in the metabolism of the Western world, the coal miner is second in importance only to the man who ploughs the soil. The importance of getting back to the land, or the importance of the land, is there. Of course, what Orwell is recognising, and making reference to that point about Winstanley's anarchism rather than socialism, is Orwell is recognising that since Winstanley's time there has been the Industrial Revolution. you've had the development of what the Marxists would call the proletariat, the working class. They weren't a feudal peasant class or close to it. However, Orwell, in the later parts of the Road to Wigan Pier, the second part, which caused controversy, went on to say, when he looked at how things could be run, and he was, in this chap, defending socialism, the truth is that to many people calling themselves socialists, revolution does not mean a movement of the masses with which they hope to associate themselves. It means a set of reforms which we, the clever ones, are going to impose upon them, the lower orders. But what he's also doing, by implication of course, is suggesting that within every possible revolution there is its antithesis, that the revolution has the prospects of betrayal if it's not well run. But what did Orwell think about the prospects of actually getting back to the land? Could Winstanley's project have worked? Because a large part of English agriculture was not that different between 1900 and the better farms of 1600 or 1700. As I say, Orwell can bring these things together in many ways. And we find, for instance, examples of this in his essay called Inside the Whale, which is nominally about poetry of the 1930s. He says, war poems apart, English verse of the 1910-1925 period is mostly country. The reason, no doubt, was that the rentier professional class was ceasing once and for all to have any real relationship with the soil. But at any rate, there prevailed then, far more than now, a kind of snobism of belonging to the country and despising the town. England at that time was hardly more an agricultural country than it is now, but before the light industries began to spread themselves, it was easier to think of it as one. Most middle-class boys grew up within the sight of a farm, and naturally it was the picturesque side of farm life that appealed to them. The ploughing, harvesting, stack thrashing and so forth. Unless he has to do it himself, a boy is not likely to notice the horrible drudgery of hoeing turnips, milking cows with chapped teats at 4 o'clock in the morning, etc. So perhaps when he was 17 and not working and sent to that farm, he was actually sent to do some work. But Orwell is recognising again, I said that there's the gap of the Industrial Revolution between Winstanley and Orwell, but what we've also got, which Orwell was recognising even within his own time, he talks about there the spread of the light industries, which of course means that you then start to get a change in the definition of what is an educated working class and where they work, which of course had terrible consequences in the 1930s when the heavy industries disappeared and the depression set in because the demand for coal and iron collapsed as it did around here. But how radical did Orwell come to be when he looked at the land? Well, one of the fascinating books, if you go upstairs and look at the Orwell collection, is the volume of Orwell's diaries. He kept diaries at numbers of different periods of his life. And essentially, they cover 2, if not 3, completely different areas of thought and experience. One of them is Orwell's political experience, his political diaries. But there are also major diaries of when he was working on his small holding at Wallington, or when he went to the island of Jura after World War II, in which he records what he was doing with the land, what his cropping was, what he was expecting, what he was planning to do with all of his crops, etc. So, that was on a personal basis. But Orwell could also see, when he had other personal experiences, he could use it as, in essence, a political investigation. And what I want to do is quote from 2 of his diary entries during World War II. In 1941, he joined the BBC, where he stayed for about 2.5 years. He worked very hard, with some periods of breakdowns of his health, and he managed to get only one holiday during that period, in July 1942, so 81 years ago this month. Yeah. So his diary entry for the 1st of July 1942. At Callow End, Worcestershire, staying on a farm. No noise except aeroplanes, birds and the mowers cutting the hay. No mention of the war except with reference to the Italian prisoners who are working on some of the farms. They seem to be considered good workers and for fruit picking are preferred to the town people who come out from Worcester and are described as artful. In spite of the feeding difficulties, plenty of pigs, poultry, geese and turkeys about. Cream for every meal at this place. Whether that's figuratively or literally true, I'm not sure. Orwell had a fortnight's holiday, 10 days later, 9 days later, 10th of July 1942. And this is Orwell's enlightened experience. A day or two ago, a couple of lorries belonging to the Navy arrived with a party of wrens and sailors who put in several hours' work weeding out the turnips in Mr. Phillips' field. All the village women, delighted by the appearance of the sailors in their blue trousers and white singlets. Don't they look clean like? I like sailors. They always look so clean. The sailors and wrens also seemed to enjoy their outing and drinks in the pub afterwards. It appeared that they belonged to some volunteer organisation which sends workers out as they are needed. Mrs. Phillips explains it. It's the voluntary organisation from Malvern. Sometimes it's ATS they send and sometimes sailors. Of course, we like having them. Well, it makes you a bit independent of your own work people, you see. The work people, they're awful nowadays. Just do so much and no more. You know you can't do without them, you see, and you can't get a woman to do a bit nowadays. The girls won't stay here with no picture house in the village. I do have a woman who comes in, but I can't get any work out of her. It helps a bit when you get a few voluntary workers. Makes you more independent-like. Sounds a bit like Mrs. Brooker at the tripe shop. And Orwell then puts in his own analysis. How right and proper it is all when you consider how necessary it is that agricultural work should not be neglected, and how right and proper also that town people should get a bit of contact with the soil. Yet these voluntary organisations, plus the work done by soldiers in the haymaking, etc., and the Italian prisoners are simply blackleg labour. In the end of 1943, Orwell left the BBC and he joined Tribune, the radical magazine, in which he published a weekly column on many different subjects. In the summer of 1944, he'd started talking about London and the London squares, where the railings around the squares had been removed, nominally in the scrap drive for iron, but possibly it's become clear as simply a propaganda exercise to make it clear that we were all in it. But then, even by the summer of 1944, the owners of the London squares, which were nominally private, were putting the railings and the fences back up round them, which outraged Orwell, who about that time was acquiring a child who wanted somewhere to play. Orwell praised the disappearance of the fences and condemned the reappearance of the new fences. He received letters of protest saying, "You're talking about stealing private land when you complain about having to keep it open." And Orwell replied in his column, "If giving the land of England back to the people of England is theft, I'm quite happy to call it theft. In his zeal to defend private property, my correspondent does not stop to consider how the so-called owners of the land got hold of it. They simply seized it by force, afterwards hiring lawyers to provide them with title deeds. In the case of the enclosures of the common lands, which was going on from about 1600 to 1850, Winstanley's time, the land grabbers did not even have the excuse of being foreign conquerors. They were, quite frankly, taking the heritage of their own countrymen upon no sort of pretext except that they had the power to do so. Except for the few surviving commons, the high roads, the lands of the National Trust, the surviving certain number of parks and the seashore below the high tide mark, every square inch of England is owned by a few thousand families. These people are just about as useful as so many tapeworms. It is desirable that people should own their own dwelling houses, and it's probably desirable that a farmer should own as much land as he can actually farm. But the ground landlord in a town area has no function and no excuse for existence. And of course this problem that Orwell refers to has returned even in our own time, as we've discovered the problems of more and more new housing estates which have been built on leasehold principles. The ground landlord, as Orwell complains, on which people found that they were liable for ground rents which were escalating year by year and have led still to complaints and have not been completely sorted out. In late 1945, having been inspired by the writer Compton Mackenzie, who knew the Scottish Islands and had written about it was to write about it in the book Whiskey Law, Orwell, through contacts, found his potential summer home at Barn Hill on the island of Jura in the Scottish Islands. And it was there that he was to spend the summers of the next few years. His house was too damp to occupy in the winters, and he intended to go back to London. Even there, his health caused him problems, and there was at least one long period when he was away, when he was in hospital, before his final illness, which took him down to the Cotswolds. But in 1946, his friend, who was an anarchist, George Woodcock, had sent him a packet of tea, and Orwell replied, 2nd of September 1946. This week, the whole of the nearest village is being brought here in lorries to get in the field of corn in front of our house. And of course, tea will have to flow like water while the job is on. We've been helping the crofter, who is our only neighbour, with his hay and corn, at least when rain hasn't made it impossible to work. The crofters have to work very hard, but in many ways they're better off and more independent than a town labourer, and they would be quite comfortable if they could get a bit of help in the way of machinery, electrical power and roads, and could get the landlords off their backs and get rid of the deer. These animals are so common on this particular island, they're an absolute curse. They eat up the pastures where there ought to be sheep, and they make fencing immensely more expensive than it need be. The crofters aren't allowed to shoot them, and are constantly having to waste their time dragging carcasses of deer down from the hill during the stalking season. I don't have much experience of stalking myself. What we've seen is that what Winstanley, whether it was necessity that drove Winstanley and the diggers to dig and plant, or whether there was also a desire of theirs to be the anarchist commune, which is implied by Orwell's reading, I can't tell you. But what I can say is that certainly that vision, and in these examples from Orwell, we can see that Orwell attempted to achieve them in some places himself. In fact, he took this so far, and this is about the point at which I'm going to wrap up with this last quotation, is from his 1939 novel, Coming Up for Air. Now, Coming Up for Air is a nominal biography of a chap who grew up in a small town in the Thames Valley, where his father ran a seed merchant's and a small corn chandler's shop. But a small business, we're told that the father doesn't have the capital to allow people to have credits, so he can't sell to the big landowners. He's always going to be in a small way of business, the people who come in and pay cash. George Bowling, this character, he grows up He gets involved in the war, he gets a wartime commission. He's injured in the war and he's sent to run a depot somewhere on the Cornish coast. And this is the description of it that's so significant. It was a lonely part of the coast. There was nothing there except Private Lidgebird, myself, 2 army huts, one of them a decentish 2-roomed hut which I inhabited, and the 11 tins of bully beef. Lidgebird was a surly old devil, and I could never get much out of him, except the fact that he'd been a market gardener before he joined the army. It was interesting to see how rapidly he was reverting to type. Even before I got to 12 Mile Dump, he dug a patch round one of the huts and started planting spuds. In the autumn, he dug another patch till he'd got about half an acre under cultivation. At the beginning of 1918, he started keeping hens, which had got to quite a number by the end of the summer. And towards the end of the year, he suddenly produced a pig from God knows where. It wouldn't surprise me to hear that he's still there, raising pigs and potatoes on the spot where 12 Mile Dump used to be. I hope he is. Good luck to him. I get the impression that Orwell would have liked that to be many more people than simply his fictional Private Lidgebird. And I think that that aspiration and his analysis ties in with everything that he'd read in Gerrard Winstanley and what the Diggers were doing. And that at least in some way or another, he was able to replicate some of it himself. Whether that's true, I'm going to ask Richard Blair to agree or completely repudiate everything I've said. But I hope that at least you found it interesting, and it will encourage you to go away and not only read these selections from Orwell that I've pointed out, but read a lot more Orwell altogether. Thank you.
When we prepared for the 80th anniversary, I think it was, publication of The Road to Wigan Pier, Les and I started coming here in towards the end of 2015. One of the books that I had read in preparation was Wigan Pier Revisited, and what was interesting in one respect was that when what it was the lad's name, Stephen Armstrong came here, he got a very different reception and reaction to the area I know well, having worked in the Sheffield and South Yorkshire area for a long time. Over there, as soon as he mentioned the name Orwell, this was some sort of hero. Over here, he got a lot of static because a lot of Wigan people felt that this was some Etonian toff who'd come up here to be rude to people, basically, which, of course, if you actually read the book, is far from the truth. His respect for Wigan people in general, the miners in particular, was enormous. And some of the other comparisons, for example, he compared the civic architecture, of which this is a very good example, here in Wigan, he felt was better than Manchester. So every event that I've organised, we've always wanted to be, if you like, good tourists in inverted commas, and we've always wanted to encourage people to visit the places, because inevitably when you think about the trajectory of his career, a lot of those places were not well-heeled, like Henley, for example, where he was as a child, and could benefit from football. And over the years we've had 2 major weekends here. Last year was the second one, and in preparation for that, I wanted to give people something permanent in Wigan to explain why Orwell came here, and that the common misconceptions were unsoundly based, and the reality was he'd come here to try and get people in Westminster, God, we're still trying to do it, to recognise they've got a responsibility to the whole country, and that there were things they could do that could make people's lives considerably better. And that was what his mission was. And I would encourage you to go and look at that little exhibition. And I'd encourage you also to take advantage of the fact that Peter Davison, who every Orwell scholar in the world has an enormous debt to, he died about almost a year ago now, with the way he compiled the complete works and other books that are a fundamental resource for anybody doing any research. When the day in 2017, November 2017, when Richard unveiled the statue of his father at the BBC, one of his granddaughters brought Peter up, and we were having a lunch we'd laid on beforehand in a pub round the corner that was one of many that Orwell had frequented. He was talking to Eleanor about his wife had died, he'd got all these books, and he didn't want things to be in a dusty archive somewhere where only academics would have access to them. He wanted them to be available to the people. And Peter spent part of his life, not a million miles away from here, in another part of the borough in Lee. So Eleanor said, well, talk to Quentin, because perhaps Wigan Museum would be interested. So we now have some of the collection, they rotate the books about a bit, but some of the collection is in that permanent exhibition at the top of the stairs. Just turn right after the plaque that Richard unveiled to his father. And some of it is available on request as you look down the library with the librarian's desk behind you, up to the right on that higher level. There are lots of books. Now most of those were bequeathed to us by Peter, and when he died, we've got some more. In fact, a week ago on Thursday, I bought some more, and we'd also been given books by Gordon Bowker's widow. Gordon Bowker was one of the biographers who published a biography in 2003, 100 years after he was born. And also we've had some books given to us by the literary executor, Bill Hamilton of AM Heath. So there's a diverse collection of books that are either by Orwell, about Orwell, or of interest to Orwell, available for you to use. And we see Wigan as incredibly well positioned, because you've got, just off the M6, you've got the West Coast Main Line, you've got the Walgate line going into Manchester, so you've got connections east and west from Manchester. You've got the M62. You're incredibly well positioned if we can get people to come tramping this way and bring some money into the town, which is what we as the Orwell Society would dearly like to see. Thank you.